Hey, how's it going? Today we're going to talk about Storybook. If you've ever thought about creating your own component library, for example, your own material UI or your own chakra UI, your own bootstrap, whatever, Storybook is the perfect tool for developing things like that, where you can use it to make components in isolation. It also works as a documentation tool that you can expose to your consumers. So that's what we're going to focus on in this video today. Now, if you were trying to create code like a library that you want to expose to consumers, you might want to do that in TypeScript, because it's just going to improve your overall experience as well as the experience for your consumers, where they probably are also writing in TypeScript, so they need type definitions, or in just general, you want to provide some better IntelliSense for them. Writing in TypeScript helps with that. So in this case, we're going to use TSDX as our zero config CLI to create a package that we can deploy to NPM. Now in this video, we are going to stick to TypeScript React, but you can use Storybook with a bunch of other things like Vue, Angular, and all other things. It's very agnostic in that sense. So a lot of the things that you learn from this video, even if you're not a React developer, I think will transfer to whatever framework of choice that you have. All right, so let's jump right in. The way we're going to get started is actually using TSDX, which has a quick start documentation here that tells you can run this command to create a new library, and then it's going to take care of all the configuration for you. And then it's also going to ask you what template you want to use. So there's a basic one in here if you were just creating, any TypeScript based library. But then specifically, if we were trying to create a library with React and Storybook, we're going to use this specific template, the React with Storybook template, which we're going to show in just a second here. And there are other ways to install Storybook. So for example, maybe you have a Create React app application. You can actually just run a command and it'll install it automatically. But the thing is, if we're trying to create a library, we're not creating an app, right? So Create React app is meant for apps, hence the name Create React app. And TSDX is meant for libraries. That's why we're going to use TSDX instead of Create React app. So what I'm going to do here is, in my terminal, I'm going to create a new TSDX library by doing npx tsdx create, and then the name of your project, your library. So perhaps I'm going to call this my components. After you hit enter there, it's going to ask you what template you want to use, and we're talking about Storybook, right? And React and TypeScript, so we're going to go with React with Storybook. Hit enter there. Author, provide something, and then it's going to start installing the npm modules for you. So after this installs, I'm going to go ahead and open this in VS Code. All right, so here it is in VS Code. You can see that's got a couple of things generated here for you. First of all, there is the src folder, which is where our actual code will be. And then there is the stories folder, which is where our stories are going to be for Storybook, which I'll cover in a second here. And then you've got a test folder to add any tests. Pretty simple, right? It also comes with a very simple README that tells you exactly how you get started. So for example, it says that the recommended workflow is to run TSDX in one terminal, and then in another terminal, you're going to run Storybook. So that's what we're going to do exactly. All right, so in one terminal, I'm going to run npm start, which runs TSDX in watch mode. So what that's going to do is, as we're writing the code, it's going to automatically build our TypeScript files and put it into the transpiled JavaScript in the dist folder. And you can see it's watching for changes, compiled successfully. And then on another terminal, I'm going to start my Storybook. So npm run Storybook. Once that starts running, you'll see that it runs in localhost 6006. And if I open that up, it looks like this, right? If you got a starting, just a welcome section here and a default for the component that we have, and it just says the snozberries taste like snozberries. And there's some bottom panels here, controls and actions, and a bunch of other things here. We're gonna go over every single option here, but we're gonna take it one step at a time. But first of all, let's take a look at what is generating this text. That comes from the code where there is the src, and within that you'll notice that there is an initial example component here that's just called thing, and it's got the the snozberries. Tastes like snozberries in there, right? And then, so that's just the source code. Within stories, there is also a thing that's stories.tsx, which has all this stuff in it. We'll talk about it in a little bit. And then it's got this template story thing, which effectively just renders the component, right? So that's how it ends up in the UI like this. Now, let's break this up into each of the individual pieces so that you know how to do it yourself. So let's start with maybe your component library. You wanted to create your own personal button, right? So in the src folder here, we're going to create a new button.tsx. All right, and within this new button.tsx file, I'm just going to create a shell of a React component. There we go. Since we're trying to create a button, we should change this to a button. And for now, let's just spread the props in there because likely you're going to pass in things like on-click and stuff like that, right? Now, up here, you can start defining your own custom props. So for example, maybe you want to explicitly call out that the children is a required prop. So let's do that. Children node. And let's say that we want to pass in a variant prop of, let's do primary and secondary, right? This is a pretty typical pattern that you would see in other component libraries like Material UI or Chakra, where there's usually a primary one where it's has a different color than a secondary one. You know what I'm talking about, right? So this is just saying that the variant prop has to be a string and it needs to be one of the choices that we apply here. By the way, if you're completely new to using TypeScript with React, I do have a separate video specifically covering that topic. If you just want to learn that first, might be a good background if you don't already know how to do it. Anyways, so since we have children here and we do want that sort of rendered, we're going to add that to children over here. And we still do want to spread props because, again, we're going to have other props being passed into this button. So, for example, things like on-click. Perhaps there's a, you want to allow people to disable the button. You know, that's all from the default props of a component, which we can also actually add extends HTML attributes of type HTML button element, right? And the combination of that just allows us to pass in props that are specific to a button element, like things like on click, disabled, etc. All right, so we've got a basic button component here, but it's not going to show up in our storybook until we start creating stories for it. So within our stories folder, we're going to create a new file called button.stories.tsx. All right, there's a couple of things we need to sort of import and configure here for every story. First of all, we need React in here. Next, we need to import meta and story from Storybook React, which you'll see how we use that in a second here. And then we also need to import our button itself along with its props. And if it's not already being exported, we need to add an export on our interface here, right? So we're importing the component and its type definition, or specifically its props. Now next, we need to configure some metadata here for the stories of this button. And this has the type meta. And first we need to create a title, which is required. So perhaps we want to put it in, let's just call it button for now, and we'll see what are the different ways we can do with this. We need to add component, which is the button, the actual imported button that we have here. And then we need to make sure that we export default this meta. All right, with that out of the way, we can start creating our stories. And the way the syntax works here is basically you just create a named function. Let's call one default, which returns a rendering of your component, right? So for example, in our case, we want to render maybe a button that says click me. And this is saying it's got the reg squiggly because we require variant, right? So let's add that in. For now, let's do this as primary. And I believe that's it. That's the minimum that you need to have to make this show up in Storybook. So you can see that there's now a new button section over here, and if we go into that, there's our default, right? And it shows click me. All right, so that's how you get a basic story out there. Let's create another story. Perhaps we wanted a specific story for what does secondary look like, a secondary variant. Now, we didn't write any CSS yet, so this is not going to look any different, right? So we got a new story in here. And if we go back to our UI, our Storybook UI, you'll see that now there is a secondary story in here. So you could think of it as stories are sort of the different variations of your component that you want to document as well as develop for. So for example, let's say that we're moving towards, all right, I want to make a button that is blue and maybe rounded, and that's going to be the primary, and the secondary might be gray. So how do we move towards something like that? So if we were to open our code again, let's add a little bit of CSS here just so that we can get it working properly. So maybe let's do just a basic inline style here, and you can use whatever styling strategy that you want. If you want to use CSS files or Sass or CSS in JavaScript, that all works with styled components as well. But we're going to keep it simple. Let's just say that if the background color is, let's pull out variant here in our destructuring. All right, so we're going to say if the variant that's passed in is primary, we're going to color this blue. Otherwise, let's make it gray. All right, pretty simple. Let's take a look at what that does. It's got a blue button, and if we go to secondary, it's got a gray button. Now the text is pretty terrible, shouldn't be that dark, so let's add some extra styles in here. Let's just default the text color to perhaps white. All right, so we're setting the color to white. You can see that now we've got a white button, or sorry, white text, and that shows up in both our variants here. And then you can kind of see how the canvas in Storybook sort of acts as your isolated development environment, right? So it does react to our code changes. So for example, if I wanted to side by side start manipulating this CSS to be a little bit different, if I want to start developing towards the look and feel that I want. So for example, I don't really like that border. Let's do border none. Maybe let's make this into a rounded button. So let's do border radius, I don't know, 100. All right, and then that's a little tight, so let's add some padding. How does 20 pixels sound? There you go. Maybe a little too much. Let's do 10 pixels. All right, so there's our basic custom button. Maybe let's also add a cursor pointer. All right, so now we got the pointer. So you can kind of see how you can very quickly iterate on your components like this. So if we switch over to secondary, see we got a gray, our ability to change the variants is working. Now let's say that you had multiple variants, right? So you can probably imagine in our stories we would just create, however many of these that we want, but that would get pretty painful very quickly. So another thing that you can do with Storybook is this idea of a template. So for example, perhaps you wanted to do, and this is where that story import comes into play. Perhaps that we wanted our template to just be the button, and then we pass in our args in here. And args comes in as a parameter, right? So once we have a template like that, we can then change this to just be a template.bind. Right? And if you're not familiar, what all that does is basically it creates a clone of this function, right? So it's effectively creating a button, right? And then secondary here, we can also simplify to be template.bind. But since secondary has different props, what we need to do is do secondary.args, right? And you can see we're passing args in here. This is where we can start differentiating the props that we pass in for the button. So for example, we said that we want this to be variant secondary, and then children, let's do I am secondary. Right, and before we go back to the UI, it's probably good to notice that, all right, the default doesn't really have any props defined, so it's probably a good idea to define some defaults in our button. So for example, let's set the default to be primary, and it also would be nice to add a default value for the children, but I only want to do that in the stories, not really in the component itself, right? It doesn't make sense for a button to have a default children. So if I want to do that, I can add within the meta archetypes, and we can add our children prop in here and say that I want a default value of let's just call it default text. All right, with all of those things in place, let's go back to Storybook and take a look. Now we've got a default primary button with a default text, and then in secondary, right, we passed in the children text as I am secondary, and then the variant as secondary. Pretty cool, right? Now there's something here that I haven't talked about yet, which is in the controls. Notice what happens now when we do that arg stuff with a template. Now there's a controls in here, which is actually one of the add-ons that you can add to Storybook that's already configured for us here. But notice that I can actually dynamically change this if I want to, for example, to something else, and the UI is just going to react to that. So it's a really nice way to create a playground, not only for yourself, but also the consumers of your library if you were to deploy this Storybook as its own sort of documentation, right? And you can see that I can also dynamically switch my variant. So that's really cool. Now this is probably a good place to segue towards add-ons, which, as you can see in the documentation for Storybook, there's a bunch of different ones in here. And then actually in the documentation, it also says that here's a list of essential add-ons that we think are sort of needed or required in basically every Storybook app. And we're going to talk about some of these, but you'll notice that in our code, there is this .storybook directory, and within that is a main.js file. Now within this file is where you can configure your add-ons, and you notice that with TSDX Storybook template that we had, it automatically has specifically add-on essentials in here, which adds all of those things that they talk about in this page. So what are some of that? Let's start by talking about let's go back to the UI. So first of all, we have, right, so we already talked about controls actually, so that's this tab over here. Let's talk about actions, which is basically, it allows you to track actions. So for example, if we went back to our code, back in my button stories, in here I can actually add a on click, and I'm going to say action, and I'll just provide a text here. And what that allows us to do is, if we go back to Storybook, I'm sorry I'm jumping around so much, if I click this default text button, now it's going to say on click, right? It's now able to track that action. So adding this, sort of think of it as it's adding a default behavior that says on click, track that action and log it out. Now this defines it for every usage of the button throughout this entire stories file, but if you wanted to, you can also do it individually on each button. So for example, we can do on click action, and I'll provide another custom string in here, and this action method actually comes in from the addon actions itself, which you can think about the addon essentials has that addon actions inside it, right? So once I add that and go back to my Storybook, when I go to my secondary and I click that, you can see that's where our secondary click is. So that's a good way for you to sort of track as you're developing your component in isolation, right? Is it able to trigger callbacks and stuff like that, you know, specifically with anything that has an on in it, right? Like on change, on click, stuff like that with events. Next, let's talk about this docs page, which is actually very cool. You might have noticed there's another tab in here that says docs. Docs is actually sort of a standalone section in your Storybook that acts like documentation, hence why it's called docs, right? So this is pretty similar to what you might see in other component libraries where they have, they have the component description and then they have examples. And then notice that we have a props table here, which is very nice documentation, right? And it has that same configurability that we had with controls. It also has a section for you to show the code, right? So think of this page as the consumer page. The people that are going to use your library, your components, this is probably the main page that they're going to go to, right? And then it's going to list out every story that you have. So if you had more, it would be down here as well. And that can also show the code to show that how does this variant or the story differ from the default one that you have up here. Is you go take a look at the code and see how it differs and what props are being passed in, right? So you can kind of think of it as Canvas is your view as the developer to develop this in isolation, while Docs is your consumer view for the people that are actually going to use your component. Now the Docs view would be nice if you had a little bit more extra text in it to explain, what is this component, what are these props, and you can actually add that very easily in the code itself. So going back into our button source code, button.tsx, you can add, for example, some comments in here. For example, provide a text for the button, or whatever description that you have would you like to use. And then you can also add a comment above the component. This is, I don't know, a special button. All right. Now let's take a look at what are the changes in the docs page once we start adding those comments. You can see that in the top here, it now has that the text that we added above the component, right? So that comment is a good place to add descriptions for the component itself. And then within our props table, it also added, you'll notice the descriptions here from our comments. And other things that are nice to see here is you can see that it shows what are the defaults. So for example, this is default primary, and then of course the controls that we talked about. So that's the docs page, and you can actually use MDX to customize this even further, which I'll cover maybe towards the later end of this video, but I want to finish walking through some of these other essential add-ons. So what else do we want to look at here? So there is these, I'm not sure actually if this is an add-on or not, but it allows you to zoom in and out, and you can kind of go back to the default using this third selection. Now these guys are definitely add-ons. So this one allows you to change the background, right? So you can see you can change it from light to dark. Maybe you're developing, I don't know, dark mode and various different, if you're trying to develop your component and you want to see how does it look in light and dark backgrounds, right? This is a good option to have. You've also got the ability to add grids. You can see probably a good way if you're trying to measure how does it space out. There is sort of this view changer that allows you to switch between, how does it look on mobile devices, large mobile tablets. Very good for maybe you're trying to achieve a mobile first design. There is this measuring add-on. I forget what they call it. I think they just call it measure. And it allows you to measure the different pixels and stuff like that. So you might be used to seeing something like this in Sketch or Figma or any other similar tool where it shows you, what are the widths of some things. This is not a great example, but you can see that it's measuring margins and padding and stuff like that, width and height. So that's pretty useful. And then this, I believe, is sort of just it just marks the spacing. So this is the outline add-on. It just helps you to kind of determine, how are your things sort of laid out. So it kind of adds, borders and stuff around the things that you make, so you can see that there's a line here and it shows that this spans the full width. So this is probably more useful for more complex components like the example they have here where you really want to pay attention to layout, right? So those are pretty much the essential add-ons. And then there are extra add-ons in here that you can kind of look through. What are the things that are available to you? For example, let's do a quick example of adding a new add-on that's not already in our application. For example, I really like this accessibility add-on. Honestly, it should be essential in my opinion. So If you click into that, it tells you that you can add this by installing Storybook addon alley. And then it'll also tell you that, oh, you need to add it to your add-ons array like this. So we'll do that in a second here. So back in our code in a new terminal, I'm just gonna do npm install -d storybook addon alley. All right, once complete, I'm gonna go to that main.js file. And remember, this is in the .storybook directory, and I'm gonna add that as a new add-on over here. So that would be at storybook / I believe they said alley, like that. And then let's take a look at our updated storybook. Back in storybook, it's not showing up here yet, so I might need to actually restart storybook. So I'm gonna kill this, and then I'm just gonna rerun storybook again. All right, now that I've restarted storybook, back in our storybook UI, there's a new accessibility tab here that does a couple other things. So this is similar to, I think you can see this in Chrome DevTools as well, but it's nice to just have it in here directly. So you can see that it automatically checks a bunch of accessibility rules for you. So for example, ensures the buttons have discernible text. So it just runs it through a bunch of rules to make sure that your library component, whatever, is as accessible as it could be, and then it kind of informs you if not. So for example, if we were to make our code a little bit less accessible by, perhaps we had really bad colors in here. So for example, if we just said that I'm going to override the colors here, if our background color, if our background color was just black, and then color as well as just black, then you don't have any contrast, right? And let me comment this out so it doesn't complain at me. Back in our storybook, we just have a black button that is pretty useless, right? So you want to have text that people can actually read. So you notice that now that we have an incomplete here, which says ensures the contrast between foreground and background colors meets the WCAG contrast ratio thresholds, right? So if the colors in the foreground and the background are too close, or not, what's a good word for that? Not far enough, not different enough to contrast with each other, the text is not going to be readable enough, right? So this is just a really nice add-on in my opinion. And again, there's a bunch of other add-ons that you can use here to look through. I'm not going to demo every single one of them. Designs is a nice one if you want to embed designs. So for example, maybe you have a Figma that's hosted somewhere, or a sketch file or something like that. You can add a new file in here that shows the design side by side with your component. There's stuff here for Next.js. Story shots is pretty interesting and allows you to do automatic snapshot testing of each of your stories. So take a look through the add-ons in here and see what is going to be useful for your own workflows. Now, I don't actually want to have black buttons like that you can't read the text, so we're going to go back to what we had before here. All right, so that's add-ons for you. Again, there's a lot more to learn about here and to see, but there's the gist of it. Now, there's a couple other things that I wanted to talk about. So I mentioned that in the docs page that there is a way to further customize this using MDX, right? So the ability to add comments like this is really nice, but it's not enough. If you wanted to have a very sort of custom documentation layout, that's where MDX comes in. So to enable MDX, what I'm gonna do is, first I'm gonna kill Storybook again, and then within my main.js, I'm gonna add MDX here. So you can see that there's this stories property which looks for any file that has .stories, and then the various file types that we enable here. So we specifically want to add MDX. All right, with that in place, I'm going to go back into my stories directory here, and I'm going to add a new, let's just reuse button again, button.stories.mdx. And then from here, I am going to restart Storybook. All right, so we got an empty MDX file here. And if you're not familiar with MDX, you can kind of just think about it as a fusion between Markdown. So if you're familiar with Markdown syntax, that's going to work in this file. And then it's kind of a fusion with JSX, so you're able to use effectively React code. And we're going to see an example of that in a second here. First, I'm going to import a couple of things in here. So like I said, with MDX, it's sort of like a fusion between Markdown and sort of JavaScript. So we should be able to use import statements like this. And then I also want to import my button again and its props. And similar to how over here we're setting up our stories with a meta, we're going to do the same thing in our MDX file here using the meta component. And we're going to add title, and let's do MDX slash, I don't know, let's call this button again. And then you have to provide a component, which is button. So you can kind of see that this is effectively equivalent to what we're doing over here, where we have title and component. And as you can see with title, you can kind of add paths to it. I didn't really talk about that to differentiate where it gets placed or organized in the UI. So if we go back into our storybook, there is now a new MDX section in here with our new button, and it's empty because we didn't really added anything else in here. But just to show again how this title, while we're talking about it, affects the placement, right? So if you add a sort of a prefix path like this, you can see that it adds it in its own section. So for example, maybe I want to add this in a components section like this. That changes that gray text over here. And then maybe it's even more nested in something else like that, components slash something slash button. So then there's, nested folders. So you can make this be as, whatever hierarchy you want to have in here. But I'm just going to go back to MDX slash button, just so we can kind of differentiate between the button that we had before and the MDX button that we're creating now. All right, so let's start adding stuff to this to actually show how it works. Now, similar to how we're able to create templates in the TSX button, like we have over here, we can also add that in here so that we can, again, utilize the same exact idea where we have reusable templates. And then we can start creating our documentation. So here's where the MDX really shines, is that you now have the ability to just add whatever you want, whatever text you want, however you want to lay it out. So for example, let's define a story for our button component, right? So I expect this to show up as a string in a UI, and then I can define stories for this page. Again, similar to how we're doing it in the TypeScript file, but in this case, we're doing it in MDX. So this needs to have a name. Maybe let's just call this my component or my button. And then similar to how we have args, right? You can do children. I am in MDX variant, and we'll just leave variant empty because it's default to primary anyways. And then within this, we're just gonna do our template.bind again, and then we'll make sure to close this. Right? Let's take a look at how that looks in the UI. And now we have got this new docs page. And notice that with MDX, it's specifically customizing this docs page, right? So we've got our text, our header, and then our button, right? And it works just as we expect it to be. Now, to make it kind of comparable to the one we had before, you might want to have like a props table as well, right? So you can add that in as blocks. So back in our code in the MDX file, notice that we also imported args table in here. You can provide that as a new thing down here, and we're gonna say story for the name that we have up here. So args table for my button story. Close that, and back in the UI again, now we've got that same view where we have the props table as well as the controls. So you can kind of imagine it as we're basically moving towards what we have over here, but we have a much greater level of flexibility in terms of layout and text and stuff like that. Right, so for example, maybe I want to have extra text description here, right? And then what else we want to do? Maybe we want to add additional stories in this documentation, kind of like how our button stories has multiple different ones, right? So for example, you can actually use Canvas, by the way, which allows you to, well, you'll see in a second. So let's add a new story in here. Let's name it secondary, similar to what we had before. And then this has its own args, MDX secondary, and we want the variant to be secondary, right? And then same thing, we're gonna do template.bind, close the story, a little bit of formatting, and let's go back to the UI. And now it's gonna start looking similar to what we had before, right? Where we have the same split here, where we have the default and secondary. Now we have my button and secondary, right? So that's how you add extra stories. And then the canvas that we added is the thing that allows you to add this code viewer. So now you can see what's the code for each individual story from the MDX, right? But again, this MDX allows you to add whatever custom thing you want to have. So for example, maybe you just had a bunch of extra text over here, now that shows up in here. So again, it's all about you for further customizing the defaults that we're able to get with docs just from the typical stories, which is already pretty good. It lays it out very well with a header, a props table, and the individual stories. But the really nice thing here is the MDX files allows you to create sort of standalone documentation pages. Like maybe you want to add documentation that's not even for components. You just want to add, installation instructions or usage instructions and stuff like that. And kind of like in this example here, maybe you want to add bigger blocks of text, which would be painful to do via the comments strategy that we had, or just in general, if you want to lay it out in a completely different way, MDX is very useful for that. And then I didn't talk about it here, but there is this really nice search bar. You can kind of filter it down to what you have, or really this is more for your consumer, I guess, if they're looking for a specific component. That's the search that they're gonna use. At a high level, that's really all you need, right? You've got Storybook that allows you to create components in isolation, and the big idea behind Storybook is that it's component driven, and it kind of flips the development model around, where if you're making an application, right, and you're adding features to it, you might go from a top-down model where you first create the page for that, and then within the page you maybe start laying things out, and then within that you create your smaller components. Storybook kind of flips that around, where instead you start to build the lower level components like your buttons, your panels, and then you can kind of start composing those components into effectively as it builds up towards your full page. So it's a bottom up development model, if you can kind of think about it that way. And in general, it allows you to do all of these things in isolation. It doesn't have to have a page. It doesn't have to have a running component or a running application. It just needs to be able to render itself. So that's why it says that it streamlines UI development, testing, and documentation. So even if you were using Storybook with an application, for example, maybe you would create React app, it might still be a very useful development tool for you to allow you to create really nice components that work well in isolation and in composition. Now, we did start this video talking about TSDX as well, right? We said that we're ultimately trying to create component libraries that, maybe it's something that you would publish in NPM, sort of like how Chakra UI or Material UI is something that you can install from NPM, right? Perhaps you want to do something the same, or maybe you're trying to do something similar internally with your own company. This is where TSDX comes in, right? So we didn't really talk about it that much, but once you've built out all your code like this, maybe, you start to have your base set of components. TSDX has a build command, as you can see here, which if we run that, you can see that what it ultimately does is it starts to compile in your code and transpile it down to JavaScript. It actually uses rollup behind the scenes. So If you need to further configure that build process, you can, if you're familiar with rollup. And then once you build, it creates this new dist folder, which you can see within that is basically your code minified and now in JavaScript, right? And it also has different builds. So for example, depending on the environment, if it's for production or development, it can provide a different type of build for that. So for example, you can see that in production they're using the minified version that looks something like this, right? It's just like one crazy minified line of code. And then the development one is something that's a little bit more readable. But in general, what is in this dist folder is something that you'll be able to publish in npm if you wanted to. And notice that it also adds the TypeScript definition. So that's really nice for your consumers that are also using TypeScript. In general, if you write your code, your library in TypeScript, it benefits everyone, even the people that are not using TypeScript. It improves their IntelliSense in VS Code. And then for the people that do use TypeScript, you automatically are supporting those people and you don't need to rely on third-party type definitions. So again, just to summarize, you can run npm run build, and that's going to build your entire set of components into one deployable that you can put out into something like npm. Now, one thing that I think I forgot to mention is that anything that you actually want to expose on the library that you're publishing, you want to make sure that's discoverable through your entry file, which is this index.tsx file. So for example, in our case, if we were trying to make sure our button is something that people can import after you publish your library, you probably want to export it in here. So we're going to add export button from button, right? So if I run my build again, we should be able to see an updated dist folder here where the index is ultimately going to import whatever is from that entry file. So in our case, it should have button in here, right? You can see here in the development build, it has exports that button equals button, right? And that'll be in the production one as well, except it's going to be minified. Right, so with that dist folder, all that's really missing is just an npm publish. So it's very close to being an actual library. So that's why we're using TSDX. Now you might also be wondering, what about the Storybook, right? We have this UI, which was a great development environment, but what if you also want to use it as an actual documentation page, right? You want to expose this easily usable documentation to your library consumers. Well, there is also a build storybook here, npm run build storybook. If we run that, what that's going to do is it's going to build our storybook into a static UI that you can basically deploy wherever you want. The one kind of tricky part with this setup is that Storybook, I believe by default, compiles and bundles your code using Webpack. And we just mentioned that TSDX is using rollup. So there's a little bit of a bundler difference there. So just something to watch out for. So if you're trying to add different loaders, you might want to make sure that it works for both rollup and Webpack. But you can see that once it's built, it's gonna add this Storybook static folder in here, which again is just a static build of the application. You can see that it also bundles the various JavaScript and stuff. And then within here, there is an index.html. If I were to just open that in my browser, you can see here index.html. If I open that with Chrome, it's just that UI that we have, but now it's just the static version of it, right? And it works just like before. All those features are still working. So all you need to do is deploy that index.html and the set of static JavaScript and CSS that comes with it, and you have your documentation, right? So kind of in conclusion, to bring the whole picture together, as a summary, we used Storybook to develop our components in isolation. We're also using TypeScript to provide the type definitions for our props, which also becomes very useful in Storybook itself because it auto-generates the props table from that. And then we're using TSDX to compile our TypeScript code down to JavaScript, and then also basically turn it into a package that we can publish into npm if we wanted to. And then finally, the Storybook UI itself, we're able to build into a static UI that we can deploy anywhere. So the combination of those two things is sort of your power tools in creating your own design system, your own component library, right? You can publish the package to npm, and then you have your deployable documentation. Now, if you didn't want to use Storybook, kind of like how Chakra is doing it, you can make your own documentation, but still have the Storybook just probably for your local development, and then still publish your code to npm. All right, guys, so there's a quick crash course of Storybook with React and TypeScript and TSDX. Hopefully that was useful for you. Let me know in the comments what you think. Make sure to hit the like button. And if you want to see more of these types of videos, let me know. Let me know in the video, in the comments, and make sure to subscribe to see more.